Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations, one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we are cutting through the noise to explore China and Africa's evolving partnership, comparing the diverse realities on the ground with how it's often portrayed globally, especially in the Western narrative. My guest today is Dr. Emmanuel Matambo. Hello?
Hello, how are you doing, Martin? And thank you for inviting me.
Not bad, thank you. Dr. Emmanuel Matambo is the research director at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. His research spans Africa-China relations, terrorism in Africa, subnational politics, and constructivist approaches in international relations. Between August and November 2019, he was a visiting scholar in the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. In 2020, he was selected as a fellow of the Atlantic Council's Millennium Leadership Program. Dr. Matambo is also very active in publishing, and I will include all his publications, articles, and projects in the YouTube description where you can check everything and you can follow his work. Let's start with the first question, and I think this is one of the most difficult questions. Why do African elites embrace Chinese infrastructure investments pragmatically, while Western narratives often label them as a debt trap diplomacy? And do we have any evidence to support or challenge these perspectives?
Well, once again, thank you very much, Martin, for inviting me. We cannot look at the reception that China is getting from Africa's elites without looking at the history that informs that particular optimism on the part of the African elite. And this extends right from the time of the Cold War. There was a time when China supported the African struggle against colonialism, against apartheid, and against settler regimes in countries such as Rhodesia, that was later to be called Zimbabwe. On the other hand, the West looked at these settler and colonial and apartheid regimes as if they were representatives of Western values, and they were also bulwarks against Soviet and Chinese socialism on the African continent. So already we see in there that the elites that fought for Africa's independence looked to countries such as China and the Soviet Union as supporters of Africa against the West that supported the racist regimes. A few decades later, we see that the continued condescension that the West had towards Africa during the Cold War had continued. In May, and I want your viewers and listeners to revisit this document. In May of 2000, The Economist, a very well-known publication magazine, ran a piece called Hopeless Africa. Now, that piece was talking about everything that is bad about the African continent and probably that the world should just give up about Africa ever developing. One of the sentences, racist sentences, I must argue, that stands out in that particular publication was that whilst despotism, whilst brutality and corruption happen everywhere else in the world, in Africa, we are uniquely susceptible to that because of issues that are buried in our culture. That is The Economist. But that happened, that publication came out at the time when China was ramping up its investment on the African continent, spurred upon by China's going global or going out policy, through which China started investing in major infrastructure projects on the African continent. And that is why even today, when the West now comes to warn us about China, the African elites usually look askance at the West to say, but you have always derided us. You have always characterized us as a hopeless continent from which nothing good could be expected. Why then are you not allowing us to quote a China that seems to be interested in Africa and the China that seems to see the promise in Africa that you, the Western partners, do not see? So that is a background. When it comes to the issue of debt trap diplomacy, again, it's the same thing. After what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democracy, through which Africa was democratizing one state one party systems were crumbling on the African continent. The era of military juntas was coming to an end as well. The African continent seems to be on democratic uptake, so to say. There was one political development that prior African leaders did not have to subject themselves to, and that was competitive elections. Now, how do you get competitive elections in an impoverished continent such as Africa? You do that by visible denotations of infrastructure, visible denotations of service delivery, and all that kind of stuff. And China seemed to be very willing to fund those infrastructure projects at the time when the West was still caught up in old and colonial modes of thinking that Africa is a corrupt continent from which nothing good could be expected. So that is why even today, as Africa has been contracting a lot of debt from China, the elite in Africa seem to be amenable to that, because first of all, this contraction of debt, this expansion of African infrastructure helps the African elite to win elections. When it comes to and this is my final point on this, Martin, when it comes to the issue of debt trap diplomacy, we have to note, by the way, that the issue of debt trap diplomacy was actually an Indian an Indian idea by Ibrahim Chelani from India. He's the one who came up with debt trap diplomacy, obviously riding on the Belt and Road Initiative. On the African continent, I do not think that there is an express design by the People's Republic of China to ensnare the African continent in debt. If there is debt trap diplomacy, then that debt trap diplomacy should be blamed by the African elite, who are contracting massive amounts of debt, knowing very well that they will struggle to pay it back. Thank you.
When you mentioned the article from The Economist, naturally I must ask you, how is Africa portrayed in Chinese newspapers or magazines? Because I know you have many contacts as a China-Africa Center in Johannesburg with your Chinese peers, with the colleagues. So how is Africa portrayed in China?
China's presence in Africa, like Africa's presence in China, has become multi-layered with time. So there are certain appraisals that have to be nuanced. When we say Africa, portrayals of Africa in China, we actually have to go deeper on what exactly we say when we talk about Africa. So when it comes to the elite, to use your word, when it comes to how the African elite are portrayed in Chinese media, they are portrayed in very glowing terms. They are portrayed through the major infrastructure deals that China is signing with the African elite. The embassies, the same thing. It is rather a different picture, though, when you talk about the increasing numbers of non-state actors from Africa going to China. These are students, business people, and a negligible number of tourists as well. So those are not always portrayed in a very flattering light, but the mainstream media in China does not pander to that, because the Chinese government, when it comes to the media, is almost omnipotent, so to say. But you find that on platforms such as WeChat and other social media platforms, yes, you find that there are some age-old racist attitudes towards Africans in general. But at a diplomatic and political level, the portrayal of Africa in China is almost invariably positive.
Many scholars and experts talk about imbalances when it comes to China and Africa economic relations, and also industrialization in Africa. How do you see these, and what about those goals for value addition versus Western concerns about resource extractions? Because we might have that layer which is typically spoken about, and it's like, we go to Africa to take some minerals, oil, gold, and all those things. But on the other hand, we don't speak a lot about how Africa's industrialization or industries are forming, that there are new businesses, new technologies. In just this week, significant agreements were signed between African countries, and we don't have much reporting about it when Africa is doing business, Africa countries and Africa, China. And when we have some reports about China and Africa, we talk about imbalances, we talk about debt diplomacy. But I'm sure that there is much deeper idea behind it. So let's speak a little bit about it.
When it comes to trade imbalances, these are just realities of international trade. Unfortunately, we are still at a stage, especially in Africa, where our industrial capacity cannot simply cope with the bountiful resources with which the continent is endowed and blessed. I will take you back to last year in Beijing at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. One of the most important aspects of that forum was the bilateral meeting that South Africa had with China, preceding the FOCAC summit itself, because President Ramaphosa had been invited for a state visit that started a couple of days before the FOCAC summit itself. And for the first time, we heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa openly addressing the issue of trade imbalances between Africa and China, between South Africa and China in this case. And that was candid. That was great. And that was also encouraging on the African continent for two reasons. The first reason was that South Africa in this case, was exercising its agency. It had realized that we cannot continue sweeping away the trade imbalances that we have inherited. Africa's so-called traditional partners are from the West, and we have a very bad trade imbalance with the West. Switching to China for now seems to replicate the same trade imbalances that are to the detriment of the continent. So that is why it was very encouraging for President Cyril Ramaphosa to bring that up. The second reason why I was so impressed, why that struck me, was that it was also a sign of the maturity between South Africa's relationship with China. Because as you would know, when you are trying to court someone at the beginning of the relationship, you say all the right things because you want to capture their attention, you want to capture their loyalty. But once you are used with someone, your relationship has matured, you can then be frank and candid with certain things that do not bode well or do not sit well with you. And what happened last year at the FOCAC was a sign of that Africa's relationship with China has matured, and the two partners can now speak candidly and openly about certain blemishes that beset their relationship. When it comes to the issue of industrial capacity, again, it's the same thing. At the moment, we simply do not have the capacity as Africa. But we have to start looking seriously at issues of value addition, because this extraction-based economy on the African continent has proven historically to be very myopic and to be to the disadvantage of the continent. What the continent should be doing at the moment is to try to commit China to a relationship that is not simply going to replicate or reproduce the extractive relationship that we had with the West, wherein they were just buying primary commodities from the African continent. We have to make sure that we make China commit to that through programs such as the Agenda 2063, which is a framework through which the African Union wants to develop the continent to improve economic integration on the African continent as well, and on issues such as the recently implemented African Continental Free Trade Area. How do we bring in players of consequence such as China to make sure that they aid the continent's ambition? Because as it happens, though, at the moment, we are still steeped in age-old limitations, structural and other limitations as well when it comes to our industrial capacity.
I must naturally ask you, because we touch on a little bit on diplomacy, in the West, you have that sort of political correctness. So you can't say everything when you negotiate with a partner, especially on the high political levels. And usually those documents are prepared by the teams of policy experts, and they make sure that everything is like top quality narrative or discourse. Do you think that this might be one of the South Africa's or generally Africa's advantage, that in Africa, people are very honest and direct when it comes to negotiations? And I think you can say things in 2 minutes that in the West would take maybe half day. Do you think that this might be the advantage when you negotiate with Chinese partners?
It's a timely question, and I will refer you to a book that was recently published. It came out on the 26th of August. The book is called Breakneck, how China's quest to engineer the future. It was published, it was written by Daniel Wang and Dan Wang. And then he makes a contrast between China and the United States. He says China is a sledgehammer, which means China is about building, China is about results, and China is about ambition. The United States, on the other hand, is more like a lawyer. It's more like everything that deals with the United States has to be legalistic, so to say. Well, I think today, after the return of Donald Trump to the United States, we will probably have a different take about the United States, because it is not really the way Dan Wang would have characterized it. The United States is also becoming more bolder, it's becoming present, it's becoming unpolished to some extent in some of the things that it has done. But yes, the material difference in the past between Africa, between China, and between the West has just been that. The cultural the cultural setups, the cultural underpinnings that influence our diplomacy. On the African continent, we look at diplomacy just like any other country, starting from our domestic interests. But at the same time, we look at diplomacy as something that has to be mutually beneficial, because we believe, especially in South Africa, we believe in this humanity, the concept of Ubuntu, if you can read about it, which says you are not a person without the other person. In short, you derive your humanity through other people. So diplomacy stands right at the heart of that particular ideology. And we find that in our negotiations, we believe that once there is a blemish, once there is a fault in your partner, then that fault will almost inevitably or ineluctably be to the adverse effects as well. And that is why we can speak more candidly. What I can draw, though, is that both the United States and China come with certain things that should be adopted from them. China's pragmatism should be adopted because Africa needs that, and Africa needs to be candid about that. But at the same time, the African continent should make sure that the respect for human rights, the respect for political rights, and respect for civil liberties are held as sacrosanct. And that is a textbook expression of the foreign policy that emanates from the West. And I think we should be able to be candid in our negotiations, both with China and with the West.
We are conducting this interview on Zoom, which is the technology that allows us to connect and speak, and our viewers can see us, can watch us. But many Africans, they don't have access to digital technologies. Still, this is a problem. And I think it's related in sort of like two vectors. The first one is the technology as it is, and the second one is the access to energy, because we know that many Africans, they don't have direct and stable access to energy. How do you see China in this? How does China help Africa to develop technology, to be more technologically advanced as a continent?
Thank you very much. Technology. First of all, it is not always going to be the case that Africa is going to be at the foot or at the fringe of the technological pyramid. As some of your listeners and viewers will know, Africa is the fastest growing population in the world. By 2100, Africa's youths, just Africa's youths, not everyone, just Africa's youths, will probably be twice as much as the population of the entire Europe. So that is how the continent is growing fast. And these are young people who want to be technologically savvy. A lot of them are technologically savvy. So they are very interested in technology. How has China penetrated in that? In a variety of ways. The first that I would mention, before I mention the issues of cell phones, the first that I would mention is this 10,000 village initiative, where China is going to produce, China is going to launch television networks to 10,000 villages and all that kind of stuff on the African continent, to make sure that the continent connects with China and the rest of the continent. The second and probably the most visible technological aspects of China in Africa are in terms of cell phones and the provision of the internet as well. There's a guy in China, in Kenya, a Chinese guy who's offering an alternative internet source. He's actually being called Mr. Wi-Fi. I think that is his nickname in Kenya. And when it comes to the issue of cell phones, the Chinese are offering more affordable options in terms of smartphones, and those have actually been claiming a very big chunk of the African market. I'll be publishing a book chapter later this year actually on China's technological penetration in South Africa. I'll send you a link once the book has been published. But it shows the exponential growth of companies such as Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo. They have been growing in leaps and bounds on the African continent, and young African people who are very interested in technology, but they want it at an affordable price that they can afford, have been latching onto that. Obviously, that sometimes comes with certain threats or certain things that have to be relooked at, certain things on which Africa has to express a lot of vigilance. Some people, for example, have been doubting the fact that Vuma here in South Africa, which is a video surveillance network, has been using Chinese technology. How does that square in with the Chinese National Intelligence Law of 2017 that says Chinese technological companies should assist the Chinese government in gathering intelligence? So we have to make sure as Africans that we're vigilant when it comes to that. The second part of your question is about energy. We have a very big energy crisis on the African continent. And we today are actually being told, especially in South Africa, that not only do you have an energy crisis, but you actually have to wean yourselves from coal, which has been the largest contributor to South Africa's energy. So you see that South Africa is being asked to leap 2 steps to catch up with the rest of the world. First of all, to make sure that it deals with the energy crisis, and secondly, to drop coal in order to opt for renewable energies. China, again, has been making a lot of headways in that. It has been investing in hydro power energy, hydro energy and wind energy, solar energy as well. Hydro energy, we can talk about the Kafue Gorge in Zambia. We can talk about the Zambezi Dam, the Calibre Dam, sorry, which connects Zambia and Zimbabwe. In South Africa, it has been doing the same. Hydro energy here, we can talk about the Adama power project in Ethiopia, which has also been funded by China, and the wind energy in the Northern Cape of South Africa. So there has been China's inroads in Africa's transition towards renewable energy. But at the same time, the continent has to do that in a way that is going to beneficiate the continent.
And do you see Chinese technology penetrating also the government infrastructure? For instance, I know that in Africa there is a big boom with the technological access to services. So in the past, you had to go to the office and wait for your number to be called, and then you spoke with someone. But now you can do many things online. So these technologies that helping the government, how do you see China in that? Because here in the European Union, we had big sort of issue that 5G technology was basically coming from China. The European Union said, oh, we don't want Chinese, we want the local ones. Then the American technology came here and it's all chaos. Some companies are using this, some companies are using that. But it's always that narrative, we don't want China to be spying on us or listening to our conversations. But on the other hand, when you speak with the experts, they said, but everything what you do on Facebook is also sort of recorded, everything what you're doing on Instagram, which is the Western technology. Is there also the consensus in Africa that technology doesn't matter if it comes from China or the West, is required, therefore we implement it? Or do you have any preferences?
When it comes to governments using Chinese technology, that has been happening. I've already spoken about the installation of surveillance cameras, ostensibly to curb crime in crime-ridden cities such as Johannesburg. Those have actually been contracted by local government structures here in Johannesburg using Chinese video technology, facial recognition technologies, and stuff like that. Zambia is another country where Topstar, a Chinese company, was actually onboarded by the Zambian government for the digital transition because Zambia's state television was running on analog up to about 10 years ago, but then its transition into digital was actually shepherded by Topstar from China. So that is an active overture by an African government towards Chinese technologies. When the United States sanctioned Chinese technologies such as Huawei, President Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, came out strongly to support China because one of the reasons the United States has also been fighting South Africa is that South Africa has been importing Chinese technologies. And President Cyril Ramaphosa said the West is simply jealous of Chinese technologies. Now, how do we appraise Western concerns about Chinese technology? Again, I'll take you back to the first point that I made when you asked me the first question. The West is simply the West is not a credible voice of counsel or a credible voice of reason on these matters. Because when the West is telling us, for example, to desist from Chinese technology, it is not doing that because it is concerned about, it is expressly concerned about fears of Chinese spying because the West itself spies on its own people. I mean, we heard during the Obama administration that they were tapping the phones of Angela Merkel. Now, this was the Chancellor of Germany, who was Obama's closest foreign leader. She was being spied on by the United States. So you can tell, you can deduce from that exactly how Africans feel if such information, if such advice is coming from the West. But this is not to say, though, that Africa should just drop its guard and import as much Chinese technology as it can. That is why it was important for me to highlight this national intelligence law that came into effect that was first brushed in China in 2017 because it has implications on Chinese technology and their obligation towards the Chinese government.
This is quite promising research topic for all the scholars, Africa's digital technologies implementation and also the infrastructure, the whole digital infrastructure. I mean, when I watch all those blogs of travelers going to African countries, you would be surprised, I mean, in the West, how much technology is implemented and changed in Africa's countries. Sometimes, of course, there is a bureaucracy, which is a problem everywhere. But I think we should understand Africa's digital technology and infrastructure in slightly different way than it's presented. I think we can also learn a lot, especially how poor people are dealing with technology. Let's turn a page and let's go to our 3 geopolitical questions. And the first one is a classic question that is asked, I think, everywhere, and that how does China's non-interference policy in African domestic politics compare to the Western conditional aid models? I think this is a hot topic, and I think we can answer that. And I would be interested in how it changed, because we see what's going on in the European Union, in the United States, and I'm sure that there is a geopolitical implication on Africa.
Important question because actually it forms in countries such as Zimbabwe and Sudan and even Zambia to some extent. The policy of non-interference forms the bedrock of these countries' relationships with China because they look at the United States with its conditionalities, the World Bank, the IMF, and the West in general with their conditionalities as being oppressive and having a colonial mentality, so to say. That is how the elite, I have to underline that. That is how the elite look at the West. And then they look at non-interference as offering a good alternative. But these are the elite. A lot of them are using China to escape Western censure and to escape Western sanctions. Because you have to realize, and maybe we might talk about the Confucius Institute later, you might realize that even though China is making some cultural inroads in the African continent, the Chinese culture has not received a lot of reception in the African continent because we are still immersed in Western cultures. So that is why, even at the level of diplomacy, our diplomatic inkling is mostly Western. We speak Western languages such as French, English, and Portuguese, for example. But why is it that there is a seeming optimism towards China? Well, it is not an optimism that is embedded in culture. It is an optimism most of the times that is embedded in African countries trying to scapegoat the West, and in African countries trying to escape criticism, not that left to their own devices they would choose China. Now, personally, I am very much against the principle of non-interference for two reasons. First of all, it is cynical, and secondly, it is simply not true. If you loan money, China through trade, through aid, through foreign direct investment, has an interest on the African continent. And when it has suited China, it has actually interfered in African politics. In 2006, it warned the Zambian government that if the opposition political party of Michael Sata, the political party called the Patriotic Front, wins the election, then China will have nothing to do with Zambia. Now, if you do not have a preference, if the preference of who you want as president cannot be stated so explicitly, then I don't know what non-interference is. So that is why I am against non-interference. I say it is cynical because it is a cynical ploy that only benefits the African elite, but not the citizens over whom they preside, and to very disastrous effects at times. So that is why non-interference should not be given the importance that it has been given. And China itself has actually realized that it has to have certain expectations from Africa. And that is why it has even scaled down its investments in terms of infrastructure. In the past, China used to have mega showy infrastructure projects. We had the Tazara, we had the Standard Gauge Railway in China, in Kenya, sorry. But all of a sudden, President Xi Jinping is talking about the concept of small but beautiful cities. That shows that China is very interested in the African continent. It has certain concerns about Africa's capacity to pay back some of its debt, and because of that, it has to scale down its non-interference and make sure that it extracts some undertakings from the African continent.
Do you consider that non-interference discourse as inflated?
Yes, it is, because it is it is a colonial era policy that the Organization of African Unity, by the way, had it as well from 1963. Why? Because they were still concerned about external interference on Africa's domestic affairs. But in 2002, Africa itself transformed the OAU, which was the Organization of African Unity, into the African Union. And the African Union inserted Article 4, inserted a clause in Article 4, in its charter in Article 4, that says African countries have to adhere to the principle of non-indifference. Now, non-indifference means we cannot let African governments get away with oppressive governance, especially if their citizens are suffering, just because we respect their non-interference. So I see it myself as an anachronism that is run by itself by debt, and it should be dumped.
And Dr. Matambo, what's about African Union? I think this is very important forum, multilateral for all African countries. How is China's position over there, and what's the development? Is it going in which direction at the moment?
China's relationship with Africa at the level of the African Union is under the framework of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The Kingdom of Eswatini, about 400 kilometers from where I'm sitting, is not a member of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation because it does not recognize, formally, it does not recognize China. But that obviously hasn't stopped China from having a lot of dealings with the African Union. China has been enlisted by the African Union to help with the infrastructure integration of the African continent, to which the Kingdom of Eswatini as well will benefit. Um, and I think recently China is actually constructing a dam in the Kingdom of Eswatini. So we see here a China that is making overtures even to the Kingdom of Eswatini itself, even though the fact that China is not recognized by the Kingdom of Eswatini does not have a lot of bearing on China's formidable relationship with the African Union. It is a relationship that is strengthened somehow by the issues such as Africa's historical and oppressive relationship with so-called traditional partners. That has actually fortified Africa's relationship with the African Union. We have seen that every time when there is a forum for on China-Africa cooperation, even the African Union Commission chairpersons attends those forums. The United Nations is really invited even to attend those forums. So it is a relationship that is formidable, but it is a relationship that has to make sure that it serves the best interests of Africa in terms of China's incursion in Africa's extractive industries. How does that add to value addition? That is the agency, that is the responsibility of the African Union to exercise.
Just the follow-up question. When those people from China are coming to Africa, for instance, you have African Union session and the Chinese sort of diplomat or officer is coming to join it either as observer or as an advisor or I don't know. What's the quality of those people?
At the political and diplomatic level, they seem to have a very good understanding of Africa's domestic dynamics in specific African countries. If you talk to them, they would have read their brief. They would have been briefed by the consulates and the embassies in African countries. So those seem to have a good grasp of local politics, and that is why even when China is embarking on political connections in countries such as Africa, they do not. In countries such as South Africa, they do not only approach the ruling party, as it was the case before South Africa came under a government of national unity. They would also approach other parties that were gaining a lot of traction. So that just showed a keen understanding of local politics. When it comes to individual African countries that are coming to ply their trade on the African continent in the textile industry, for example, some of them just follow word of mouth from their people. In Zambia, for example, a considerable fraction of Chinese people who are in the business sector in Zambia come from the Jiangxi province. So some of the people take back stories about Zambia, the potential that is in the country, and that is how they come. So those might not know exactly what is happening on the ground in Africa, but they would trust the word of mouth from families and friends who are inviting them to come to the African continent. So those are just the dynamics of how much they seem to know about the African continent. But at a general level, especially those in elite institutions and those at the political level, they tend to dwell much on Africa's history with China, how China helped Africa to attain independence, for example. And that is the context or the background from which they think Africa shares a very strong relationship with China.
I have three questions about some particular topics. And the first one is the Confucius Institute, which is a very popular sort of soft power instrument of China. And in many countries, it has a controversial reputation. Some people, they argue that it helps to spread the Chinese culture, while other, they just say like, they might be sort of like industrial spies or there is some sort of intelligence, like in those institutes. And even some schools, they banned Confucius Institutes in the West. How is the situation in Africa and how African students and scholars approach this institute?
When it comes to Confucius Institutes and their popularity on the African continent, the interesting thing is that in as much as Africans in increasing numbers are very interested in learning about Chinese culture and Chinese languages as well, their effect has not really been appreciable. What is clear, though, is that there is an uptake of Africans who are now fluent in Mandarin. But whether or not that has kind of reoriented how Africans feel about China compared to the West, the jury is still out. And my suspicion is that that has not really happen. But what the Confucius Institute help is the cultural or the soft power presence of China on the African continent. I do not buy, unlike Western detractors, I do not buy that Confucius Institutes are used as technological tools for spying. Because who are you spying on? The students that attend the Confucius Institute classes? Maybe that is different in the United States, where maybe the uptake or the intake of Confucius Institutes is different, and maybe it incorporates people who are politically consequential and all that. But I don't buy that on the African continent that has been the usage of Confucius Institutes. It is a soft power approach. It has been there is an increase of African students who are learning Mandarin and, most importantly, are interested in studying in China. Because Confucius Institutes are not only teaching about language and not only teaching about Chinese culture as well, they also are a tool for China alerting Africans about opportunities for business and opportunities for studies in China. And that is why recently China actually overtook France as the biggest recipient of African students. And the Confucius Institute, I think, has played a very good midwifery role in that particular aspect.
And may I ask how easy is to access this institute? For instance, you are a regular student, let's say at a bachelor degree in South Africa, and you want to know something about China. And you would like to maybe learn some basic words, sentences, maybe to, as you said, to discover some opportunities to study in China. So, for instance, I live in, let's say, Johannesburg or Cape Town. How can I access this institute? How easy is it to do this?
Very easy. South Africa, I think, has about 6 Confucius Institutes. We have one here at the University of Johannesburg. So they're very easy. As long as you're a student enrolled at the University of Johannesburg, you can approach the Confucius Institute. It's embedded in the Faculty of Humanities. You can go there and register. If I'm not mistaken, some classes are actually free of charge. So if you are interested, a lot of people have been registering. We had a growing number of enrollments until obviously the onslaught of COVID-19 had a node, so to say, at the intake of students, because it was not very interesting for students to learn Mandarin, which is a difficult language, online. So that is what kind of ate into the numbers. But they are readily available, and if your university has it, it's very, very easy to enroll.
And is there sort of alternative for Chinese students in China to approach sort of African institute? Or is there any soft power instrument of, for instance, South Africa in China? So they have the sort of similar or the same opportunity?
They do not have centers, African embedded centers in China, but some of China's institutions of higher learning are actually teaching African languages, most prominently Zulu, which is a South African language, and Swahili as well. And that is to prepare some people who are interested on coming to the African continent. But there are no African institutions that I've heard of teaching African culture in Chinese. But obviously, Swahili and Zulu, those are actually taught by African lecturers and teachers who are, playing their trade in China.
And would you be happy if South Africa sort of develops some sort of institute or similar instrument in China? So you have sort of balance. Chinese, they would have Confucius Institute in South Africa, and China would have some South African Institute in China. Do you think that this is important to do? Or do you think that sort of institutional cooperation, let's say universities, that's sort of enough?
The feasibility of it all is what I'm not sure about. What would inform, for example, South Africa to have institutions across Chinese universities? How many of those people they are interested in coming to the African continent? South Africa, yes, has been getting an appreciable number of Chinese tourists, and I don't think I've seen a lot of Chinese students studying in South Africa. So what is the feasibility? What would be the feasibility? I think that would be my question. I really wouldn't know how to answer that. What is the feasibility of starting such an institution? What I would say is more realistic, though, are exchange programs the last point you made now about universities. That we have been doing already. We actually, here at the University of Johannesburg, historically we have been running what we call summer camps, where a group of South African students go to China to go and learn China's uh, history, to go and, well, some of them to have experiences on China's infrastructure, its speed trains and that kind of thing. So if we can concretize that and try to attract as well some students from China to come here, even if it's for a semester, in terms of exchange programs, I think for now that would be more practical than institutions established in China.
And may I ask about the younger population? Uh, Many people ask, what is the cultural influence from China on this segment of society? For instance, you have the institute. Maybe there are some more channels through which China is trying to promote its culture, its business, its educational opportunities. But how is this received by young people? Let's say you will speak with someone who is 18, 17, maybe 21. What those people say about China, and how do you see this development of those sort of like instruments slash soft power?
It is a very difficult question because it matters who you are asking. If I'm asking students of international relations, those who are of a very militant and radical type look at China with very positive, with a very positive light, so to say, because they think as if Africa has been ripped off by the West for long enough, and it is high time that Africa now exercised its agency, and by agency, by the way, they mean let us opt for China. With the disturbing returns of coup d'etat in countries such as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, for example, it was surprising to see that young people were actively supporting these military seizures of power. Now, why were they doing that? Some of them were doing that because they are from Francophone countries, and for a long time, France has exercised colonial era power over them. So they thought these with putting these military governments now in power is going to kick the French out and then bring probably the Chinese and the Russians in. So those type of youths, if you ask them, and a lot of them are people who are involved in institutions of higher education. So those would actually have a positive thing to say about China, but judged obviously from the relationship that Africa has had with its erstwhile colonial powers and with the West in general. Now, if you ask some people who work, some younger people who work in Chinese factories, for example, or even in Chinese shops, they have a sense of resignation, and I've written several articles about this. They have a certain sense of resignation. They despise the Chinese for the work conditions that they are subjected to, and the cases of violence, labor abuse, and very limited pay as well. But they have resigned themselves to that unpleasant or difficult employment because their own government cannot provide employment. I'm sitting in South Africa right now at the moment where youth unemployment is hovering around 40%. So these are the people who could subject themselves to unspeakable conditions of employment, but employment nevertheless. So that is why I'm saying the perceptions that people have of China are not uniform, so to say. They have a socio-economic dynamic to them because those inform the lens through which you look at China.
And when you mention those working conditions and labor abuse, how is this at the moment? Is it improving in the way that African governments they are implementing some measures, or is it sort of like forgotten area, let's say in that way?
At the moment, because of what has been happening in the United States and the West in general, and there's some improvements in terms of technology as well, through which there is now mechanized production on the African continent, the issue of labor seems to have taken a back foot because the whistles have been blown in countries such as Zambia and in countries such as South Africa, where the Congress of South African Trade Unions has raised that alarm. And we have seen that the Chinese government is very, very sensitive, by the way, to perceptions outside China. So Chinese state-owned enterprises that come to the African continent have shown a readiness, so to say, to kind of temporize uh, their terms of condition on the African continent. But then we have to look at individual Chinese entrepreneurs who are coming to the African continent and private Chinese enterprises who are coming to the African continent, whether or not they are complying with local labor legislation. That is the issue that should be studied at the moment, even though it has kind of been lost, especially since COVID, when job employment was kind of disrupted. We have seen that concerns about labor legislations have actually been dampened down.
How is African diaspora approaching China abroad? I'm sure that you have many colleagues from Africa at the different universities and institutes. Is there sort of enthusiasm to research China? Is there enthusiasm to go to China for, let's say, internship or some sort of research stay? How is this situation? Because I know that many Africans, they are doing excellent research abroad. And I think diaspora outside of Africa is also very, very important for all African countries.
The diaspora is very vital. It has actually been recognized as one of the regional economic communities for the African Union. It is very vital. What the diaspora has been very much concerned about right now is the rise in critical minerals and just energy transition and technologies as well. These have been very important for scholars in the African diaspora. Now, if there is any agency or if there is any interest in them to study in China, that is mostly at a postgraduate level. A lot of Africans want to go and study in China. And I think China offers great opportunities when it comes to issues such as business studies, technological studies, engineering, and stuff like that. In the social sciences, there isn't a very big uptake. And Africans, by the way, even African institutions here in South Africa, they look askance at some of the qualifications that are attained in Chinese higher institutions of higher education. So that is what has been happening. With established scholars, very few of them, especially in the social sciences, would want to go to China and work there or collect data from there. But what is important to note is, I've already mentioned students interested to go to China, first of all, because some scholarships are readily available. Journalists as well have been very, very crucial, and this has been with the Chinese government's invitation. They have been inviting increasing numbers of journalists to go and do some courses of some sort in China. And I think that is because journalists are very crucial in terms of presenting a certain perception of China on the African continent.
Dr. Matambo, the last question for today's interview. Can you tell us a few words, few sentences about your research at the center, and maybe to inform our colleagues what are you working on, and maybe what they can join, so that when they are interested in, they can write you an email and maybe they can pursue some possible potential cooperation. I know that this center is quite unique because of the focus. So it's like Africa, China, but there are scholars from more African countries. So I take your center as sort of Pan-African. It's not like South African only, but it's also Pan-African. And this sort of uniqueness, I think it's very, very important. And it's very connected with the University of Johannesburg, which is doing very well in all world rankings. So please use this time and inform our viewers about your projects, maybe some flagship projects that you are working on.
Thank you very much, Martin. Before I answer your question, I first would like to thank you and I thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I found it very enriching. And thank you, by the way, for having a lot of interest on the African continent as well. Now, leading that into my response is that a lot of times the West has been interested in knowing Africa at an institutional level. That is why we're usually called Africa. The way the West is called the West sometimes, even though in today's age, you have to look at individual countries, so to say. When it comes to our center here and the work that I do personally, I am not only looking at Africa's relationship with China at the level of institutions and the level of the elite. I have come to realize that whilst China in the past used to present itself in Africa in terms of diplomats, in terms of people who were coming to work at multinational corporations, and in terms of people who came as medical doctors, for example, from China, today we have seen that there is more synergy, there is more interaction at a non-state level, even at a people-to-people level. And I think that is one of the most important aspects of China's presence currently on the African continent. Howard French, in his famous book called China's Second Continent, that was published in 2014, said the interaction and the perception that China is creating, the interaction that China is having with ordinary Africans, and the perception that is being created at that level will actually do more to influence Africa's relationship with China rather than any state formulas from Beijing. So that is why I have tended to approach Africa's relationship with China from a people-to-people perspective. I'm looking at people, how they interact on factory floors. I'm looking at how they interact in local communities. So that is what I have been doing personally. But the center in general has been involved in much more than Africa-China relations. It has been involved in Africa's relationship with the developing world in general. We have written books about BRICS. We have written books about Xi Jinping. We have written books as well about African integration and China's place in African integration and China's place in African industrialization. So we are that sort of a center. We embody the spirit of the University of Johannesburg, which you have rightly said is quite an ambitious university, founded only 20 years ago, but today is actually a leading university on the African continent and even in Africa, in South Africa. We are right at the top when it comes to issues such as research. So that is just what the center here tries to embody as well. So people who are interested in our work, you can visit the website of the Center for Africa-China Studies, and then you can visit my LinkedIn as well, my LinkedIn page, which I know Martin has visited. And then there you can tell that most of my research is, yes, Africa's relationship with China, but at the level of people to people as well, not just confining myself to the level of the elite, whom we have spoken quite at length here about here with Martin. So I will end it there, Martin. Thank you.
Dr. Matambo, many thanks for your insightful thoughts, that you share your research outcomes with us. And I think this is the way to interact or to engage with China and Africa, to speak with people who are conducting research at the center. And I'm very thankful for your attitude, for your time, for your approach to this topic, because you spoke very openly, very honestly. And I think this is one of those characteristics that I really appreciate when I speak with my African colleagues. Dr. Matambo, many thanks for being on IR Thinker.
You're welcome and good luck. Thanks, bye.
Thank you.